Hello, friends. The 999th day of the war between Russia and Ukraine continues. Last night, the main Western media outlets began to report en masse that U.S. President Biden had approved long-range strikes against Russia. The following is known in brief from these publications. The lifting of the ban concerns ATACMS missiles and is limited to the territory of the Kursk region. Whether it applies to the entire territory of the region or only to the combat zone is not exactly clear. CNN writes that the lifting of the ban will not have a military effect that would strategically influence the course of the conflict. It will not fundamentally change the situation at the front. Just as the long-range missile strikes against the rear of the Russian army in the captured Ukrainian territories, which have been carried out since last year, could not stop the advance of Russian troops in the Donbas, so missile strikes against the Kursk region are unlikely to become the factor that will turn the tide there. A bigger problem for Russia will be if Ukraine begins to launch missile attacks on Russian energy infrastructure. In particular, at the substations of the Kursk NPP and at other facilities, in order to de-energize entire cities and regions, as is now happening after the strikes on the Ukrainian energy infrastructure. But it is not known whether the Americans will give the go-ahead for this. And if they do, the damage will not be comparable to what Russian strikes, which are not limited to a zone of a couple of 100 kilometers from the border, can cause to the Ukrainian energy sector. In addition, it is not known how many ATACMS missiles the Ukrainian armed forces have left. The main consequence, if permission is really given, is a sharp increase in tension in relations between the West and Russia. Putin has previously publicly stated more than once that strikes by Western long-range missiles would mean the direct entry of NATO countries into the war against Russia, and even updated the nuclear doctrine for this. Moscow has also stated at various levels that it will give some kind of military response to this. But even if this does not happen, it will definitely be even more difficult to agree on a speedy end to the war, since the level of hostility between the West and Russia will increase sharply. And this, it is possible, is the main purpose of issuing the permit. Thus, the Western War Party, while Biden is still in power in the United States, is trying to make it extremely difficult to conclude an agreement to end the war, which, according to media reports, Trump is ready to offer after taking office as U.S. president. Issuing permits for missile strikes is one of the last opportunities for the War Party to disrupt these agreements. If Russia gives some kind of military response to Western countries and the United States in particular, then, for the War Party, this is also a good option, since at a minimum, it can remove the question of any agreements with Russia for Trump and initially place it on the agenda of military confrontation. And at a maximum, if the scale of the clash between Russia and NATO escalates, it may become a basis for disrupting the transfer of power to Trump, keeping it with the Democratic Party. Moreover, for the establishment in Washington, the appointments already announced by Trump look like a real disaster. The main problem is that the transition of the confrontation between Russia and NATO to the military stage can very quickly escalate into a nuclear format and cause a world war with mutual destruction. And then it will not really matter what the last name of the U.S. president is. When the material was already ready, U.S. State Department spokesman Matthew Miller said that he had no information on the position update on allowing long-range missile strikes. I have no updates on the U.S. position on long-range strikes against Russia that I can tell you about today. As you know, even before Russia launched a full-scale war, the United States created a coalition of more than 50 countries to provide assistance to Ukraine and deter Russia. We will always adapt our assistance to Ukraine's needs when necessary. And you have seen how we have stayed on this course, gradually increasing assistance over the past few years. But I have no news on long-range strikes that I could tell you about today, Miller said. On Sunday morning, Russia launched a large-scale missile attack on Ukraine for the first time since the summer. It targeted the energy sector. 120 missiles and about 90 drones were launched. During the attack, Ukraine turned off 7 of its 9 nuclear reactors. At the same time, there is no total blackout in Ukraine. This indicates that most likely, most of the nuclear power units were temporarily turned off before and during the missile attack, and after its completion, they were promptly launched. That is, there was no significant damage to the infrastructure for transmitting electricity from the nuclear power plant. There have been no such strikes for 3 months. In this regard, the new large-scale attack is surrounded by various explanations. According to the version supported by the Ukrainian government, Russia had been planning the attack for a long time, stockpiled missiles, and, having waited for the cold weather and increased load on the energy sector, carried out the shelling. According to Kyiv, Moscow has stockpiled missiles for several more such massive strikes. Moreover, the cold snap on November 21 will sharply intensify, as forecasters predict. Also, mainly in Russian telegram channels, there is a version that Moscow learned in advance about Biden's decision to allow long-range strikes and decided to show in this way that it will not leave it without a response. According to the third version, which is defended by the former advisor to the presidential office Arestovich, the shelling is forcing the West to peace by Russia. The Russians have undertaken to explain to us and Trump what will happen if we are intractable. And they will explain at least until the inauguration on January 20, he wrote. At the same time, strikes in the current format on thermal power plants and hydroelectric power plants, as well as on substations in certain regions, although painful and lead to power outages, but power engineers have already learned to stop them quickly enough. A really serious problem, which is fraught with a global blackout, will be if the Russians strike the substations of nuclear power plants. Let me remind you that nuclear power plants provide the majority of the power generation in Ukraine. Then, it will be necessary to shut down nuclear reactors for a long time, and there may be no power in Ukraine for a very long time. The Ukrainian authorities have been saying, since September, that the Russians are preparing such a strike. But Moscow has not launched it yet. According to one version, it is saving it as a response to Western missile strikes on Russian territory, or waiting for the onset of cold weather. On the situation at the front, the Russian army has made a sharp advance in Chasiv Yar and has almost reached its center, says Bild military observer Julian Ropp. FPV drones were used against Russian soldiers, not Ukrainian ground troops, writes Ropp. The deep state map confirms that Russia has advanced in the Zhovnivy micro-district from the canal and has managed to gain a foothold. And a gray zone almost reaches the city center. A serviceman with the call sign Mutnoy writes that the Russians were able to consolidate their positions in the central part and reach the outskirts of the fireproof plant. This is now the key point of defense. If we sag here, this will be the end of the city's defense, he adds. The General Staff has not yet reported on the situation in Chasiv Yar. Let me remind you that at the end of October, the Russians managed to advance in the Chasiv Yar area for the first time in a long time, breaking through the canal that served as the main line of defense of the Ukrainian armed forces. To the south of Kurakovy, Russian attempts to close the cauldron continue, which includes several villages controlled by the Ukrainian army along the Suhy Yali River. The Russians have advanced along 2 flanks of this semi-encirclement from Trudovy and Downy. The throat between the villages is narrowed from about 6 to 4 kilometers. To the north of Kurakovy, the Russians have advanced to the village of Beresti and are already 3 kilometers from Stary Turny, the capture of which would mean the threat of blocking the main road to Kurakovy from the west. Yesterday, the Russian Defense Ministry announced the encirclement of units of the Ukrainian armed forces near Olguvka in the Kursk region. We are talking about the Bolshoi-Olguvsky Forest in the northwest of the Ukrainian bridgehead, where an offensive by Russian troops was previously reported. Moscow claims that yesterday morning the Ukrainians tried to break out of the cauldron, dozens of Ukrainian soldiers were killed, and 24 people were captured. Ukraine has not confirmed this. At the same time, the Telegram channels of the Ukrainian armed forces reported a small advance by Russia in the northern sector. Russian military Telegram channels write that a cleanup is underway in the forest. If the Russians take the Olgovsky forest, they will unblock the road from Korenivo to the south to Novoivanovka and Zeleny Shlak, simplifying logistics with the front. Russian Telegram channels also write about a number of tactical offensives of their troops in the Zaporizhia region in the Orikhiv area. Ukraine has not yet confirmed the intensification of hostilities there. At the same time, spokesmen for the Ukrainian armed forces expect that the Russians may go on the offensive there in the near future. Friends, this channel exists solely thanks to your support. If you have the opportunity and desire to support the channel, I will be very grateful to you. Thank you very much and see you in the next video.